Just for a little bit of context before we dive in, just a reminder that we dive into the story of David, and David's story, in a sense, comes in the middle of a story of God and his relationship with his people, the people of Israel, and how the people of Israel have decided they want a king like the kings that the nations around them have. And so, as a result of that, we have King Saul, who was chosen. At first, as I mentioned, Saul was a very good king, a very successful king, but eventually Saul begins to go down a dark spiral, a dark path, and is rejected by the Lord. And the Lord instead chooses David. David is chosen by God just by being the youngest of his brothers, the runt of the litter, almost a forgotten person. But the Lord chooses him because what we read is the Lord does not look on the outward appearance the way others tend to do, but the Lord looks on the heart. He chooses David because he sees in David a heart after the Lord's own heart. And David has been chosen by God, anointed by prophet Samuel. Saul knows that the Lord has prophesied that he, Saul, will lose the kingdom, that the kingdom will be taken from him. But Saul does not know who is his replacement yet. And in the story that we saw last week, God raises up David to fight against this great Philistine warrior king, Goliath. And by the power and help of God, David has defeated Goliath. So that's the background to the story. And what we see here is a very interesting story. It's a very simple story. It's a story of two choices. Two choices. How will you respond to God's chosen king, to God's anointed king? I remember that growing up in the church, we looked at several tracks or methods for sharing our faith, sharing the gospel. I'm sure many of you have heard of, for example, the 4 spiritual laws. That's a very typical one that's existed for a while that emerged, I think, out of Campus Crusade for Christ, the campus ministry. Many in the more kind of Presbyterian world have seen and used and looked at other methods. I'm thinking of James Kennedy's evangelism explosion, for example. One of the ones that we looked at once was a simple kind of method that was called 2 ways to live. And what it really highlighted is the Bible's continually presenting to us 2 paths. As it were, are you going to turn to the right or to the left? Or are you going to choose this or that? And it's funny, this is one of those stories that just presents us with a simple binary choice. There are 2 possible responses when God presents you when you have an encounter with God's chosen king. And we're going to look at those choices. So God has raised up David. David has had this victory. He has fought on behalf of his people. He's obtained this great military victory on behalf of his people. And David is sort of presented before Saul. And David gives sort of a recount of what's happened to Saul. And Saul's firstborn son, we would call him the crown prince, the heir apparent, Jonathan, is there. Jonathan is a great warrior in his own right. And if we were to go back in 1 Samuel, we would see some of his stories. And it's very interesting because whether they know it explicitly or not at this point, and Saul, if you were following along carefully, is beginning to suspect that David might be the one to replace him as king. Both Saul and Jonathan have a lot to lose. Saul is currently the king of the kingdom of Israel, and Jonathan will be, or ordinarily would be soon, right, the king of the kingdom. Both of them have this kingdom that is sort of in their hands, and David, one way or the other, represents a threat to that kingdom. But what's interesting is, while Jonathan and Saul, in a very real sense, both have the same thing to lose, namely the kingdom, and all that power, prestige, wealth, etc. that comes with it, their responses to David are so different. The first response we see here is friendship. That's Jonathan's response, and that's what we see in the first 5 verses of 1 Samuel 18. And it looks like loyal love. You should have, by the way, an outline of the sermon, help you follow along, okay? And we see this in verses 1 and 3. We see in verse 1, the soul of Jonathan. So David comes, he gives a presentation. We only have a summary, but it was likely a long conversation and dialogue. But at the end of it, we read that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And it's this sense of loyalty, of binding together. That idea of knitting together is a language typical of the Bible, that is covenants or pacts. The idea that people kind of bind themselves to each other in loyalty, in friendship, almost in deep family ties. Covenant, I mentioned this before, covenant in the Bible is a way of creating family bonds where there is not necessarily a direct family relationship. In the Bible, if you're connected to someone by family, by blood, there is an implicit assumption that you are loyal to them, right? If you've got a brother or a parent or an uncle or a cousin, and something happens to them, well, it's your duty as a member of the family to go out and help, of course, because you're bound by a common blood, your family. Covenant is a way of extending that same relationship beyond family, and it's basically creating new family relationships with one another. The obvious example is marriage, right? You have the covenant of marriage creates a new family out of two. In the Bible, that's a common metaphor for covenant. Or adoption, right? This child is not your child directly, perhaps we would say now genetically, but becomes your child through adoption. That's also seen covenantally. This is the language here. In fact, we read that Jonathan, in verse 3, makes a covenant with David, makes a commitment, basically says, you're now my brother, right? We are brothers together. And it's love. We read that Jonathan loved David as he loved his own soul. It's funny, a lot of scholars in more recent times have read passages like this. Later, David will say that he loved Jonathan more than he had loved any woman. And read into this that there's some sort of homosexual relationship between Jonathan and David. I think this would just not be even conceivable to the writers of these texts. I think it's sort of sad that we can't help but read any deep, loving friendship between people of the same sex without assuming there must be something sexual going on. But there is nothing sexual going on. There's no even hint that there's something sexual going on. It's just a very powerful picture of true friendship. In fact, I'm going to kind of the great reveal of the story, right? The surprise ending of the story. I'm just gonna spoil it now, okay? David is very clearly here presented to us as a type, as a picture, as a signpost of Christ. He is God's anointed. Anointed is literally translated into the Greek Christos, Christ. So we have David, Christ. We have David as God's chosen king. And Jonathan's relationship to David is clearly portrayed as the ideal relationship of the believer to Christ. Christ in the New Testament is described as our friend. We'll get into this in a bit. As our elder brother. And all those who commit to Christ in covenant and commitment and loyal love have a powerful love that is the highest love. That's the point. Jesus essentially says this. When we skip forward in time into the New Testament, Jesus shows up on the scene. And in Luke 14, verse 26, Jesus says this startling message. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, Jesus is doing something that he typically does, which is speak in hyperbole to make a point. He will otherwise speak of the importance of loyalty and love to your family and to your parents and to your siblings, okay? But he is saying your love and devotion for me, for Christ, for Jesus, should be so high that it will look like you hate everyone else. Saul will soon see Jonathan's love for David and interpret that as hatred for himself, which of course it isn't. In other words, if you love David, who is a threat to my kingdom, that must mean that you hate me, Jonathan. Of course, that's not the case. But that's what it will look like. That's the point. Christ is saying, your love for me is going to look to others like it means you hate everyone else. And it's not that you literally do, but it's that you prioritize Jesus, you prioritize me. And that's what's happening. There's a mutual love between David and Jonathan, powerful friendship, of supreme loyalty. And as we already saw in verse 3, Jonathan and David covenant with one another. And think about what this means. This means that there's this loyal love from Jonathan towards David, towards God's anointed, chosen king. And it means total surrender from Jonathan's part. Total surrender. And we read something incredible in verse 4. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. This is a symbol of Jonathan voluntarily. David is not asking for anything. David has not shown up and said, hey, I'm the new king, God chose me, so thank you very much. Saul, I'll take your crown. Please exit the building. This is now mine. That's not what David does. In fact, as we continue to read the story of David and Saul, David refuses to take the kingdom from Saul. That's one of the main things about the story. David absolutely refuses to usurp the kingdom. And he waits until God delivers the kingdom to him, until God removes Saul sovereignly through other circumstances. So that's not happening. David is not demanding surrender, but Jonathan's heart goes out to David with such love that Jonathan is essentially, symbolically here, surrendering the kingdom to David. The robe, this picture of the robe in 1st and 2nd Samuel is very clearly symbolic of the kingdom. So Samuel tells Saul in an earlier story, Samuel, as God's prophet, as God's spokesperson, says to Saul, Samuel on behalf of God, Saul, God's taking the kingdom away from you. And Samuel turns around to leave, and Saul grabs onto Samuel's robe and pulls on it, and it tears. And Samuel turns around and prophesies, just as this robe is torn, so God will tear the kingdom from you. Right? Picture of the kingdom. Later, Saul will be sleeping in a cave, and David has an opportunity to kill Saul, and David refuses to do so, but he cuts off a corner of his robe. Again, symbolic for the fact that the kingdom will eventually be his. Jonathan is refusing to hold on to his robe, i.e. to hold on to his kingdom, i.e. hold on to what is his right, what are his rights and privileges. And Jonathan, out of love for David, surrenders his robe, surrenders his kingdom, surrenders his armor to David. He does so because he loves David. And so he surrenders to David, and he supports David. He supports David in all of David's endeavors, all his kingdom work. And so, David's going to go out. He's going to be set up as a commander of 1,000, right? And he's going to be sent out to do battle, to do war against Israel's enemies. And Jonathan is setting David up for success, providing him with arm and support. In other words, Jonathan is surrendering his rights, surrendering his inheritance, surrendering his kingdom, and he's saying, I am here to support what you want to do. Not my priorities, not my plans, not my conquests, but how can I help you accomplish your plans, your conquests? How can I help you advance your kingdom? That's what Jonathan is doing here. There's so much to draw from here. Okay, as I've said, it's so clear that what we see in Jonathan is an example of what a right response to God's anointed king should be, to God's Christ should be. And what Jonathan does is he responds, he sees God's anointed and he loves God's anointed. He loves God's king. And his love for this king means total loyalty, that covenant bond. You are my brother, you are family. And total surrender. Absolute radical surrender and total support. And that's what it looks like to surrender to Christ. To surrender to Christ and to dispose yourself to him. This is what it looks like when a Christian puts their faith in Christ and is baptized. Their baptism symbolizes a death to the old life. It's a surrender of life lived for myself, and it's a surrendering and a giving your life over to Jesus Christ. My life belongs to you. I no longer take hold of my kingdom, my plans and my ambitions, and I surrender my plans, my ambitions, my priorities, and I give them all over to you. And you got to think about the cost that means for Jonathan. I mean, if you were the heir apparent to a king, and this is not a parliamentary or democratic monarchy. This is a total monarchy. You are the king, you are the boss. Everything is at your disposition. And Jonathan gives that over. That means that Jonathan trusts David. Because David could perceive Jonathan as a threat to his kingdom eventually. But Jonathan trusts David. And in surrendering the kingdom is entrusting his own life to David. And here's the amazing thing. Jonathan was willing to give everything up for David. And we know that everything that he would give up, or practically everything he would give up, he would have received in return. We know this because tragically later Jonathan dies. But eventually when David does become king, and he does become king eventually in the story, Jonathan is dead. And David says, no, I still am loyal to Jonathan. Jonathan might be dead, but are there any family members left to whom I can show this loyalty to? And it turns out we'll get to this eventually, but there's a son of Jonathan called Mephibosheth. If you're thinking of naming a child, that's what I would recommend. And Mephibosheth is a cripple. And Mephibosheth is a potential challenge to David's position on the throne. As a descendant of Saul, as a descendant of Jonathan. And what does David say? David doesn't have him killed or exiled. David invites him, brings him into his home, into his palace, and has him eat from his table all the days of his life. And that's a picture of what Christ does to us. If we surrender our kingdom, what we receive in return is infinitely greater. And supremely to eat at the king's table. To be with him forever. It's interesting because everything that the Lord asks us to surrender to him is something that he himself first surrenders to us. I don't know if you've thought about that. We read later in Philippians 2 that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself, we would say, further by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. In other words, we're invited to trust and to love and to be committed to Christ and to surrender everything to him. And when we do so, what we realize is we are only doing so in response to the fact that he surrendered everything for us first. He, being God, in the form of God, came down as a person and as a human being served us ultimately even unto death and was later therefore exalted. And so we surrender ourselves and surrender everything that we have to a king who has surrendered himself and everything that he has first for us. Even when we surrender to Christ, we're only doing so in response to him first surrendering everything for us. There's a beautiful song called Have It All, and the first verse says, "Oh, the joy I found, surrendering my crowns at the feet of the King who surrendered everything." We surrender everything to the feet of the King who first surrendered everything for us. That's the first response. I love how Elizabeth Elliot once put it. If my life is surrendered to God, all is well. Let me not grab it back as though it were in peril in his hand, but would be safer in mine. That's one response to God's kingdom. Friendship, love, trust, covenant, surrender. This morning, have you really done that? You know, there's another response, which is Saul's response, which is enmity. I wanted to write enemyship. And I Googled it, and apparently it is a word. To my surprise, I've never heard it before, but it is a word used by Thomas Paine, apparently. But thought enmity sounded more appropriate. Enemyship sounds funny. But you could think about it that way, friendship or enemyship. What's your choice? That's what we see with Saul. Saul sees things very differently in verses 6 to 16, right? He immediately begins to suspect that David is a rival, a potential rival to the kingdom, right? He sees David, in some ways he recognizes the same thing that Jonathan recognizes in David, but his response is the opposite, right? David's victory makes him jealous and insecure. You have these women who come out and sing, Saul has killed his 1,000, but David is 10,000. I'm sure that didn't make him feel any better. And he says something very true and very powerful. He says, what more can he have but the kingdom? Very true. But Saul had an opportunity here. He could have surrendered voluntarily like his son. And I'm convinced that if he had, despite the discipline that was over his life because of his previous sins and behavior, I think he would have experienced mercy at the hand of God. We see this over and over again in the Old Testament. The Ninevites, right? God prophesies through Jonah. The Ninevites are sinful. In 40 days, they will be destroyed. It's a prophecy. This will happen. And so Jonah just shows up and announces to Nineveh, 40 days, and this whole city will be overturned. And the king proclaims a fast. Let's repent. Let's ashes, tear our clothes and ashes and sackcloth, and let's repent. And the people do. And what do we read? God doesn't say, well, I've already prophesied it, so I can't turn back now. God relents. God relents from what he had prophesied, what he had said would happen. God actually turns it back. He doesn't destroy Nineveh. I'm convinced, at least potentially, right, at least theoretically, that if Saul had shown humility, humbled himself, recognized, yes, David is God's righteous king, and this is right, I have done ill. I'm not saying Saul would have held on to his position as king, but I have no doubt that grace would have been afforded to him. But Saul has a response that reminds me a lot of Pharaoh's response to God's prodding through Moses. He hardens his heart. He becomes more stubborn and steadfast in his rejection of God and rejection of his anointed. We see in verses 6 to 9 that he has distrust and fear. And this is not the good kind of fear of God, like that reverence for God. It's more of that distrustful, jealous fear. What's happening is he's rejecting David. And what this shows us is Saul loves his kingdom more than God's kingdom. Right? Saul refuses to surrender his kingdom to God's kingdom. Right? And the result of this is unyielding resistance. This is the rest of this section here from 10 to 16. And what we see is that Saul's constantly in this section seizing, taking hold, grabbing hold, refusing to let go of what is his. It's very interesting. He's holding on. And I think this raises up a question. How many people in our culture, do I dare say how many people in this place, I don't know, are holding on to their kingdom? Not willing to do what it takes to say, you know what, I'm not king, you're king. Like the picture of the ancient men in Revelation that cast their crowns before the throne of the Lamb. We see this in several ways. It's very interesting. Saul, for example, tries to seize David. Look in verse 2. It says, and Saul took him that day, that's David, and would not let him return to his father's house. The language there is literally of seizing, of grabbing hold of David. It's sort of like, I'm going to try to control David. If David's on the scene and he's a threat, I'm going to see if I can use David to promote my kingdom, but not promote his kingdom, right? I'm going to try to see if I can use David to bolster my kingdom and my role as king. And that can sound so silly, but think about this carefully. In our culture, in our day, aren't so many people doing the same thing with God's anointed, i.e. Jesus? I'll have Jesus, but Jesus is in my life to bolster my kingdom. I'll have Jesus in just the right amount of doses to make me feel good, more religious, more moral. I'll pray to God when things are bad. I'll pray to God for things to be successful. Jesus becomes some sort of great cosmic genie. You know, I'll rub the lamp and hope that he might answer, right? He's like a talisman. Or he's someone that I use to assuage my conscience or to feel better compared to other people in the world or in the culture. But it's an attempt to seize, to control Jesus. Jesus, I need you to be at the service of what I'm doing. I've got plans. Jesus, I need you to rubber stamp my plans, my ambitions, my hopes and dreams and expectations. I think that's more subtle than we realize. You see this. Saul takes hold of David and he sends David out to fight his battles. You know that one of the main roles of the king in Judah was to be the warrior king. He was supposed to lead his armies in battle. We'll see later that David, way later, years later, when David gets into trouble, it all begins because David stops going out to the battlefield. David starts sending others to fight his battles for him, and he just starts to relax and rest, sleep until noon. And actually, I'm not joking, that's when his troubles begin. Saul's doing the same thing. He's using David to go fight his battles, and he's probably hoping, hey, if he's out there on the front line, maybe someone else will do the dirty work for me. Excuse me. And that's what we're seeing here. Trying to use David. And I think the lesson for us is, friends, don't try to use Jesus. Don't try to seize Jesus for your own purposes. Surrender to Jesus. Surrender your life to Jesus. Any Jesus that we're using for ourselves or for our kingdom is a false Jesus. It's a fake Jesus. It's a fake God. It's a God that we've created. And if we deal with the real Jesus and we refuse to surrender, the actual response is we will want to get rid of that Jesus, get rid of that king. That's what we see with Saul. He ultimately wants to murder David. We read in verses 10 to 11 that Saul becomes overcome with rage and tries to kill David. He tries to pin him to the wall with a spear. And this happened a couple of times. I mentioned this last week, but think about this. David goes out to fight Goliath, this giant, this tall warrior who comes at him with a javelin, with a spear, and defeats him. He goes back, and the king, who's supposed to be the good guy, who also happens to be a very tall man, now comes after him with a javelin and a spear. It's the one who's supposed to support him and help him. Think about what happened when Jesus came onto the scene. He came onto the scene, and there were some who recognized Jesus as who he was. Remember, Peter, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are in other words, you are the Messiah. You are the King. You are God's chosen King. There were those who recognized Jesus, surrendered to Jesus, and became good friends with Jesus. Remember, Jesus turns to his disciples towards the end of his life and he says, I do not call you servants. I call you friends. Friendship is what the Lord is seeking. But there were others who saw Jesus and saw they couldn't seize him and control him. And what was their response? It was murder on the cross. And it's so funny, Jesus comes back to us over and over again, and Jesus tells us there is no nuance in response to Jesus. There's not a spectrum of possible responses. We think there is. There isn't a spectrum. It's a binary black and white choice. Jesus is very stark. He puts it this way in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12. He says, whoever is not with me is against me. And whoever does not gather with me scatters. Black and white, binary. Friendship or enemyship or enmity. That's what we're seeing with Jonathan and Saul. No neutral ground. And so the question for all of us always is, you have your own kingdom. You have your own life. And are you going to seize it, to grab hold of it, and to refuse to let go? Or are you going to surrender and receive in return something far greater than anything you would lose? Do you remember Jesus himself says, let me read it directly, actually. I think it'll be more helpful. It's not in my notes. He says, whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever surrenders his life For my sake and the gospel's, what shall he save it? What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? And that's the question for all of us, for every single person in the world, is how are you going to respond to the king that God has established? There's a case of a man, it's interesting, he was originally called Saul as well. He eventually became known as Paul, but he was a Pharisee. He was amongst the group of men who were involved with this rejection of Jesus. He probably wasn't directly involved with the events that led to Jesus' crucifixion, but he sure would have supported it. He sure would have agreed with it. He later went around persecuting all those who were friends of Jesus, all those who were followers of Jesus, the early church. And he was involved with supporting the stoning, the martyrdom of Stephen, and was involved in putting people into prison who followed Jesus. And he was on the road to Damascus, right, to throw more Christians into prison. And he has this encounter with the risen Jesus, right, the risen King. And it changes him forever. He goes from someone who was persecuting the church to someone who was promoting the church, going around the Roman Empire of the time on the Roman roads and sharing the message of the gospel, sharing the message of God's saving King Jesus, who brings the victory to his people, and planting churches, establishing new churches. And for that, Paul lost his status as respected, elder, statesman, as it were, of the Jewish people, his role as Pharisee and kind of rabbi. He was rejected by his people, eventually imprisoned by the Roman Empire. You can go to Rome and find the purported site of Paul's martyrdom. He was eventually beheaded for faith in Jesus Christ. But he clearly, we know from the letters that he wrote that are preserved in the New Testament that he believed it was worth it to surrender even his life to Jesus. And he puts it very well, and I'll conclude with this. I think he was willing to do all this because he was gripped by a promise that I think is very well summarized in the book of Isaiah that he quotes. He writes a letter, 1 Corinthians 2:9, and he describes very powerfully why he felt it worth everything, total surrender to Jesus. And we read there that he says, that he quotes from Isaiah, "What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him." What the Lord has prepared for those who knit their souls to Jesus, who surrender their robe to Jesus, is far greater than anything we can lose. Supremely, it's the greatest gift of all, which is himself. And so I just want to encourage you, surrender your robe. Surrender those things that you're holding on to, that you're seizing, that you're holding on to, and you're unyielding to in your life. Surrender them. Say, Jesus, I trust you. I entrust my life to you. I trust that I cannot even imagine what you have for me. Let's pray.